everybody? Steve with Tam Books coming at you with this author spotlight series that we started doing with Paul Thigpen of the book Saints Who Saw Hell. And he's written more than one book. I don't even know how many is it. Is it a baker's dozen yet?
It's 54.
54. Okay. Quite a few baker dozens. So,
been doing it a long time.
I'm sorry?
Been doing it a long time. So.
Yeah, not the last weekend during the lockdown. You decided to just start penning out a bunch of books and send John, say, "Here you go, buddy."
Yeah. And I got a few more to come, if Lord willing, if you'll give me the time.
There you go. Well, Paul might be on here more than I am. So, for this specific book, what's it about? Obviously, the dumb question is Saints Who Saw Hell, but is there more into that than just that? Well,
it's Saint Benedict, Pope Benedict, who said during his time as Cardinal Ratzinger that people just didn't talk about hell enough today. That it's a subject that had kind of gone out of fashion, and he wasn't the first, obviously, to note that. I've noted it myself many times, and Father Frederick Faber, who's an English convert from a century ago, was even talking about it then. How people thought it was an uncomfortable subject and we should leave it alone. And but his reply was, "So is the only purpose of religion to make people feel better then, or is there supposed to be some hard edge of reality in it?" And so Tan had a book before, Saints Who Saw Heaven, and then I've done a book with him called Saints Who Battle Satan. And so we thought, okay, how about this one? And in some ways a little reluctant. I remember how when C.S. Lewis was writing his famous book, The Screwtape Letters, he talked about how it was the most difficult book for him to write because he was having to put his mind into the mind of a devil all the time and think that way. And it wasn't that way for this, but it is still the kind of thing that if you immerse yourself in it for several months, as I had to, these visions and thinking about those things, you have to always balance it out with talk about God's mercy as well as his judgment.
Yeah, I can see how that could maybe lead to despair if you're just reading about hell and thinking of hell all the time.
Well, that and people have different levels of scrupulosity. I guess if I've been that a presumption, I'm afraid, tends to be my sin more than scrupulosity. But I even have to kind of say to readers now, keep in mind the book is. I actually wrote a book called My Visit to Hell one time. It's a fiction. It's the only novel I've ever written, and I borrowed the storyline from Dante's Inferno, but set it in 20th and then with an update 21st century Atlanta, which some people think is next door to hell.
It is hot Atlanta for a reason.
Yeah, right. That's right. And from Georgia. So, but anyway, similar kind of thing that I like to tell people that book, its setting was hell, but the book was really about God's grace.
Yeah, watching a Braves game in the 80s when they were terrible in the middle of July was probably like hell.
That was kind of hell, right? Yeah. So it's the same way. The book is, I said, so it's the same way here. The book is about hell in a sense, but ultimately it's about God's grace, about his mercy. It's a way of reminding us, St. Teresa and her vision, Teresa of Avila, points out her specific vision was that God showed her the place in hell she would have occupied if she, were to be damned. And so she just saw it as this great act of God's mercy. She began to love him and appreciate him even more because she saw what she had been saved from. And that's one of the reasons to dwell on these kinds of things, to think about them, give them consideration. There are other reasons as well, but one of them is it helps you to appreciate what God has done. It cost him his own son to keep us from that place.
Yeah. I've heard before from saints that the fires of hell is the mercy of God. It's just you don't get to see him. It's kind of like purgatory. It's the same heating system.
It is. The church fathers had some of them had a really great comparison. I think they would say that the fires of hell and the fires of purgatory and the light of heaven are all really the same thing, the holiness of God. That if we die and are in opposition to God, we're his adversary, we're his enemy for eternity. We experience the fire of his holiness, which Hebrews tells us about, that our God is a consuming fire. So it's a symbolic thing, but that kind of thing we experience as torment like light to a diseased eye. Can't bear it. And even in this life, you'll see sometimes people who are really deep into darkness and evil can't stand to be around people who are holy. Not myself, but other people I know. So that holiness of God, it's a torment to them because they don't embrace it. They hate it. They don't want to be around it. But the same holiness of God for those who are in purgatory, it's painful, but it's cleansing because they have all these things that need to be burned out. And so the fires of purgatory that are referred to in Scripture, the cleansing fire that St. Paul talks about, is again an act of God's mercy, and it's the same holiness. It's just the disposition of the heart. And then finally, when we're well and finally in heaven, and all that stuff has been burned out, what's left is so purified and beautiful that it's kind of like a diamond that has been through the carbon that's been through the fire, the coal that's been through the fire. And now that it's purified, we experience God's holiness not as burning fire, but as radiant light. And it's like light that comes into the diamond and scatters everywhere. We become prisms of God's light. So it's a beautiful way to think about it. God's nature doesn't change, but how we experience our encounter with his nature depends on the disposition of the heart. And that's why we have to talk about hell. That's why Jesus talked about hell. That's why the church has talked about hell. That's why our generation needs to talk about hell.
Yeah, and one of the chapters you bring up is the Fatima Children. So if Our Lady could show that to a 7-year-old, or was it 7, 9, and 12, I think you got the adults can handle it.
Yeah, it is, and that's one of my favorite stories. Not the vision itself, but the story that goes with it. Sometimes people ask me, "Well, of all the saints that you saw, you've written about their encounter with seeing hell, what's your favorite one?" And Saint Jacinta is in that story. Why? Because we find from Saint Lucia, we find out later that it just changed her so much, and that it made her zealous for the salvation of souls in a way she'd never been before. And so there are these beautiful stories, as I'm sure our listeners know, they were shepherd children. They'd be out during the day. In the summer in Portugal, it can get pretty hot, and they would have to bring water with them and food. But she was always urging the other children, pray for poor sinners, pray that they won't go there, because that's what Our Lady had told them in the vision. And so for her, that becomes one of the main purposes of the vision, not that she was headed there with her purity of heart, but that she was supposed to pray for others. So she would even do things, not just pray for them. They said she would pray for hours on her knees out there in the rocky ground. But she would make small sacrifices for sinners. She would offer, instead, when she was really thirsty, she'd offer her water to the sheep instead. Or she'd give her lunch to the sheep and say, "I'll offer this up for poor sinners." And, oh my gosh, what a sweet thing, a child that young. But she got the message. She got the message of Our Lady. We've got to pray.
Yeah, you see that loud and clear. It changes you. That's what they say. If it weren't for Our Lady being there, they would have died on the spot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you already asked the first question would have been, what's your favorite story? So what's second and third favorite stories?
Well, those are stories, as opposed to the vision themselves. None of the visions, it's kind of hard to say that they are favorites, but in the sense that you enjoy them by any means or entertain. Right. But I don't know, each one of them has its own kind of main point to make. There are others that could have included that are so similar that I thought try to make them ones that have some differences, and that's a point we should talk about. That Pope St. Gregory the Great, one of the great fathers and doctors of the Church, in the 6th century, he was reporting visions that from people that he knew were trustworthy, and put them into his book, The Dialogues. And then a friend of his that he was having the dialogue with, I guess it's a real person, could have been a fictional, somebody he had dialogue with, but I think Peter was at one point asked him, "Well, are we to take these literally? Because it's hard to believe that, this vision of man talks about trees and bricks and walls and a bridge and a river and hell." And so, he said, "Well, I think it probably, these things that they see rather than literal are depictions or symbols of much deeper realities." But the thing to remember, and I always remember this too, is that if you do have language like you do in the Scripture of fire, worms, darkness, weeping and gnashing of teeth, when people hear that, they say, well, we don't take that literally. We say, okay, but if you don't take it literally, then what it means is that the reality is much, much worse than the literal would be. That Jesus, and he spoke, and others, that they are stretching the very limits of language and trying to describe a horror that's beyond human expression. So it should not comfort us or make us dismiss it and say, oh, well, that's figurative language. It's not literal. It should make us say, oh gosh, what is the reality like that it's even so much worse?
Yeah,
so you do have.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes, no, go ahead. Go ahead.
So my friend Father Ripker is an exorcist, and he talks about hearing from exorcism sounds that no human can replicate. And
you have some of the images when they talk about. I mean, some of the visions have visions of the demons and of the devil himself that. Oh my gosh, that's worse than my worst nightmare. Yeah. But also, there are kind of common patterns here that I think are useful. One of the things that the saints will say again and again is that it's not that God casts us into hell, but that we end up choosing it by rejecting Him. That in the end, we really do have free will, and that's an important thing to remember. That we are making choices every day now that can lead that direction. And then second, that in some way the punishment itself is kind of the ripened fruit, the culmination of the evil that results from our sin. So they'll often have different punishments for different sins depicted. Part of what that does is to show us that, wow, even though I'm doing this now and it may feel good and it seems not so bad, they're kind of ripping the veil off of that and saying this is where that leads, because the culmination of that sin is something very deeply wrong. So that the fact that the pattern that they are supposed to be warning others about it, that's why they're allowed to see it. That it often leads to appreciation of God's mercy, as in what I said about St. Teresa of Avila.
Yeah, that'd wake me up.
Yeah. And so it's, why even pay attention? Why would I collect them and put them in a book? Because it is good to talk about hell, and I don't just talk about the private revelations. I talk first about the scripture, of course, and what Jesus had to say about it, and that's on a whole different level, and I make sure it's clear in the book that we don't accept private revelations, even the ones the church has approved, as if they were on the same level as scripture and tradition, sacred tradition. That private revelations, especially the ones approved by the church, are clearly for us to apply the eternal public revelation of the church to our everyday lives, and these visions do that. And I should note there's several divisions in the book. The first are visions reported by saints who have the visions themselves, and then the next section is visions reported by saints who were getting them from other people that they thought trustworthy. So, like Pope St. Gregory the Great, he did that. The Venerable Bede, St. Bede of England, did the same thing, some others. And then we have some that are visions attributed to saints, but those two are books that kind of read like scripture, like the Apocalypse of Peter, that kind of thing. And what makes them weighty is that it's, they were not included in the biblical canon, so obviously they're not up there with that. But it is interesting, when they first came out in the early centuries, they were some of the earliest visions of hell in the Christian tradition. And there were plenty of Christians who thought they were scripture. Church finally said no, but that still tells you the weight of these books. That even someone like St. Clement of Alexandria or others would actually say, I think they are scripture. So that means it's something weighty for us to consider, at least. And then you have I have others that are just given by kind of Catholic witnesses to the damned. They're not canonized, but they sure seem to have some interesting and helpful insights. And then finally, what I call legendary and literary visions. So the voyage of St. Brendan, the Irish navigator, some people may have known about that. Probably a lot of that's legendary. It may not be, but he traveled to an island, according to the legend, that was basically an opening into a portal into hell, and saw the demons there. So that's included a small section from Dante's Inferno, and actually a section from the book I mentioned before, the novel that I wrote, My Visit to Hell. That's kind of literary visions of it. So I try to. I think there's some people who have said to me, "Why didn't you just stick with approved revelations from the saints?" But there's so much else to be gained from the rest of it, and none of it is that, except the scripture stuff, is to be put on the same level of scripture.
And if I mean, even the story of Saint Anne, how Saint Anne and Saint Joachim were before the Immaculate Conception, this comes from apocryphal writings. So for us to get history
received early on, and yet the church is found in that stuff that even though the book is not scripture. So the other ones, especially those early ones, they really are compelling visions. Mm-hmm. So compelling that, like I said, a lot of early Christians thought they were scriptures. So until the church ruled on it. So just I think each one of them kind of speaks for itself. If you read it, I think it'll be obvious in some way why I would have included it. The kind of things the kind of fruit that it can bear. Not of making people terrified. Mm-hmm. I've had several people say, after I read the book, I went straight to confession. I said, yes, that's right. That's why you're supposed to read the book. That's what I want to hear. But others, too, say it just made me understand more deeply the mercy of God, what he saved us from. It's giving me more a picture of evil so that I will learn to hate it. Mm-hmm. I have somewhat close connection to Flannery O'Connor, the great Catholic story writer, American short story writer. She was from Savannah. I'm from Savannah, Georgia, and I actually know some of her relatives and friends. And my mother went to college with her, so I've always, for a long time, enjoyed her stuff. And it's so funny. A lot of people will read her. If you haven't read her, you need to at least try it. Or read her stuff, and either they really like it or they really don't like it. And one reason why they kind of separate out that way is that her characters tend to be kind of eccentric to the point of bizarre. And that's one reason why some people call her fiction Southern Gothic. Mm-hmm. It's like the dark Gothic stuff with the bizarre characters. And then they get into all kinds of eccentric situations. But one of the reasons I love her stuff is that when she depicts evil in a character, and it's usually not some kind of horrible Jack the Ripper, unusual guy. It's just evil in everyday life. Mm-hmm. Somebody who's mistreating others or that kind of thing. By the time you finish reading her story, you say, if that's evil, I don't want any part of it. I just don't want part. She pulls off the pretense. And there was so much of that in the Southern culture that she was writing from and about. She pulls off the mask of pretense and exposes it for what the evil really is. And you say, man, I don't want to be like that. I don't want to do that. And it's a similar kind of thing here. I think it helps us to see the ugliness of evil and to be repelled by it. And that's a good thing.
What was something that didn't make the cutting board, something that got edited out that couldn't make the final piece that you wish would have made it, that readers wouldn't be able to know, that readers might not know about, that would be interesting?
Well, before you said that last part, I was going to say there's a whole lot more from the Inferno that I would have loved to include. I mean, it's obviously the whole book, and yeah, with copyright things and stuff, you have to. The little passage I have is kind of like my little translation, but that's a hard question to answer. Just mostly snippets from some of the visions that I had that I just had to condense. Some of them are quite long, book length themselves. Some of the early ones, some of the vision of Merlino that's in here, I had to do just a short piece of that. Again, in all of those, they're so compelling. Sometimes it's like looking at a mirror and saying, "Oh no, that sounds like me." When I wrote my novel, My Visit to Hell, it's so funny that one of the experiences I had was that my friends. So just to set it up, in Dante's Inferno, you have circles of hell that go deeper and deeper and deeper down into finally where the devil's at the bottom. And in each circle, there are certain sins that are punished. And so I have all kinds of characters in there, kind of modeled kind of on Dante's characters, but they're of course much more recent. And my friends began reading the book, and they would come to me and say, "Paul, that character in Circle 3, is that me?" And I just say, "Well, the shoe fits where." I wasn't consciously modeling, maybe just a 2 or 3, the characters of people I knew. But as I say in the introduction to that book, if you're worried because you see yourself in one of these circles of hell, I see myself in every circle, one way or another. And that's the point, to make sure that we don't end up there, that we embrace the goodness of God, we welcome his mercy, and we seek to be conformed to the image of Christ instead.
That story reminded me of Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, the Final Judgment scene. A cardinal that Michelangelo was getting in arguments with, he painted in hell. So the cardinal goes over to the Pope. Hey, Michelangelo put me in hell. He goes, well, if it was in purgatory, I could do something about it, but I can't do anything about it.
I didn't hear that story. That's great. And some of the great, I'm trying to think, was El Greco? Some of the great artists, when they would paint a crucifixion, they would paint themselves into that scene, but either as one of the soldiers crucifying him or guarding him or that kind of thing. And their face would be, instead of looking at him, the face would be looking out of the audience. And people who knew the artist said, oh my gosh, that's the artist. And what a humble thing to do. Yeah. I mean, it's an act of penance, actually, to paint yourself in there that all will see for generations, that you're basically saying, yes, I'm the one who put the nails in his hands because of my sins.
That was a cool thing about Mel Gibson in The Passion, too, with the hand.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So it's a cleansing thing, to admit that and to do that. So, yeah, so many reasons to read these stories.
Yeah. So what would be, this final question, what would be one story, if you could take all the saint stories out, and not Saint Fatima one, what would be one that someone said, this is one that I would recommend you read?
Wow. All right, I've got the book in front of me. I'm going to look down the table of contents just to refresh my memory. So I'm not thinking one that I would probably say The Apocalypse of Peter, one of those early.
Really?
Yeah. Books that, that were not received in the church. They're just the detail and the fury of them, the intensity of them. And also because it helps you realize this is not a late phenomenon. This is early on in the church. The early Christians were thinking about these things. And so, yeah, that's probably the one it would be. But tomorrow,
I haven't read that part yet, so I'll take a look at it.
Okay. It might be different tomorrow. I don't know. St. Teresa of Avila is very compelling to me. If you have any sense of claustrophobia at all, she has the place where God showed her where she would have been is like this confined thing that she's closed in, almost like in a coffin with fire and stuff. You say, "Oh Lord," but that's part of the. You think about the imagery, and she just says that, and that's part of the reason for reading these things is that you begin to ask yourself, why would it be like that? And you get the same thing in Dante's Inferno, and one of the places where the souls are trapped inside trees for eternity. And it's because it's showing that's what evil does. Finally, the evil choices cause you to close in on yourself, collapse in on yourself, to reject all that's not yourself. And in the end, all that you have left is your self without grace, and that's hell. That's what hell is.
Yeah, I keep thinking of Bosco's dream and the angel telling him to put his hand on the outer wall. And he was at millions of miles away. This is the furthest wall from the center, and it's that hot.
Yeah. And and what a great warning there too. I mean, because the boys that he cared for, he was seeing some of them in the vision slipping down into hell. How much more it motivated him than to get back there and
exactly. He woke up with his hand blistered.
Yeah.
Well, Paul, I appreciate your time doing this. For everyone down here, the link underneath the video will get you right to the page, Saints Who Saw Hell. Order at tambooks.com. And we'll have Paul on again to talk about other books, including saints who battled Satan that he mentioned earlier. But Paul, thank you for your time and appreciate it.
Thank you, Stephen. My pleasure. God bless you, brother.
You as well.